The settlement was dead. What had once been a thriving colony was now a graveyard of shattered metal and burning debris. Smoke hung thick in the air, turning the sky into a dull, choking haze. The acrid stench of scorched earth and charred flesh clung to everything, seeping into Garen's armor, into his lungs. The familiar scent of war. He moved cautiously through the wreckage, rifle raised, boots crunching over broken glass and twisted scraps of ruined infrastructure. Signs of life were few: scattered belongings, abandoned tools, blood smeared across a collapsed barricade. But no bodies. That was worse. Raiders didn't leave bodies behind, not intact. His grip on the rifle tightened as he scanned the ruins. He'd seen this before. He knew how it played out. First, the bombardment, to force the colonists into hiding. Then, the ground assault, sweeping through homes, dragging survivors into the streets. Those who resisted were cut down. The rest? A sound cut through the distant crackle of fire. A child's cry. Garen froze. His body reacted before his mind did, shifting into a battle-ready stance, senses sharpening. The cry had been faint, but it was close. He adjusted his position, weaving through the rubble toward the source of the sound. He found them in the open courtyard of what had once been the settlement's central hub. A woman stood in the center of the wreckage, silver-blue skin streaked with dirt and blood, her long black hair unbound and wild in the smoke-filled air. She was holding her ground in front of two children, shielding them with her body as a group of raiders surrounded them. She was outnumbered, unarmed, and backed against the crumbling foundation of a collapsed structure. The children, both young, their small frames trembling, clung to the fabric of her tattered cloak. Their wide, violet eyes darted between their mother and the raiders, silent but terrified. One of the raiders, a brute of a man, his patchwork armor stained with old blood, stepped forward, a cruel grin splitting his scarred face. "Pretty thing like you," he drawled, voice thick with amusement. "You got two little ones to feed, huh? Tough luck. Ain't much food left here." The woman said nothing. Her gaze locked onto him, calculating. The renter chuckled, nudging the man beside him. "Maybe we take her with us, sell her off, could fetch a good price. My children are well behaved." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Firm, steady. The laughter died. The raiders exchanged looks, as if uncertain whether to be amused or confused. She took a slow step forward, lifting her chin. "I can be a good wife to you, human." Garan felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. This wasn't a plea, this wasn't submission, this was strategy. The woman knew she was out of options. She knew how raiders worked, how they thought. A lone woman was disposable, but one with value? That was a different game. She was trying to buy time, trying to shift the situation into something she could control. But Garen had been around men like these long enough to know it wouldn't work. The raider laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "You hear that, boys? She thinks she gets to choose." He reached for her arm, fingers closing around her wrist. "You're coming with us, either." Garen pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the ruined settlement. The raider staggered back, a fresh hole between his eyes. He was dead before he hit the ground. For a second, there was silence. Then everything happened at once. The remaining raiders spun toward him, reaching for weapons, but Garen was already moving. He fired twice more, dropping the closest threats before diving for cover behind a scorched vehicle chassis. Plasma fire erupted around him, burning holes into the metal. The woman didn't hesitate. She snatched a fallen pistol from the ground and pulled the children behind the remnants of a support beam. One of the raiders tried to flank Garen, but he was too slow. Garen lunged out, blade flashing. The man barely had time to grunt before Garen's knife sank into his throat. Another turned to run. The woman shot him in the back. The last raider, panicked, desperate, fumbled with his weapon, trying to aim at her. Garen fired first. The shot struck true. Silence fell again. Garen exhaled, stepping over the bodies as he approached her. She was still holding the pistol, her hands shaking. The children were pressed against her legs, their tiny fingers clinging to the fabric of her cloak. Up close, she looked worse than he'd first thought. A gash ran along her temple, dried blood streaking her cheek. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but she remained standing, steady, unyielding. He lowered his rifle. "You're safe now." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. The younger of the children, a boy barely past toddler age, peeked out from behind her. He looked up at Garen with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you going to take us too?" he asked, voice small. The words hit like a gut punch. Garen knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "No," he said. "I'm here to help." The boy hesitated, glancing up at his mother as if seeking permission. She finally spoke, her voice quieter this time. "Why?" Garen looked at her for a long moment. He thought about all the battlefields he'd walked, all the bodies he hadn't been able to save. Thought about the things he'd done in the name of survival. Then he thought about the way she had stood in front of those children, unarmed, ready to fight anyway. He stood. Because someone has to. For the first time, something in her expression cracked, the smallest flicker of emotion. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, Garen felt it too. The journey away from the ruined settlement was slow and grueling. Garen led the way, his rifle slung across his back, his senses on high alert. The woman, still unnamed to him, followed close behind, her movements careful despite the limp in her step. The children clung to her, small hands gripping the tattered fabric of her cloak as they navigated the uneven terrain. The sky overhead was a dull, bruised gray, the air thick with the lingering stench of smoke and death. Garen kept them moving, cutting through the abandoned outskirts of the colony, past shattered vehicles and collapsed structures. He knew the raiders would regroup eventually. It was only a matter of time before they came looking for survivors. Hours passed before they reached a temporary shelter, an old maintenance station built into the rocky cliffs. The structure was half buried, its reinforced walls scorched from past conflicts, but the doors still held, and that was all that mattered. Garen pried them open and ushered them inside, sealing the entrance behind them. The interior was dark, the air stale with disuse. Emergency lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The space was small, cluttered with rusted tools and storage crates, but it was defensible. Safe, at least for now. The woman sagged against the nearest wall, exhaustion evident in the way her shoulders slumped. The children stuck close to her, silent but watchful, their wide violet eyes darting between Garen and their mother. Garen moved to one of the storage units, prying it open with the butt of his knife. Inside he found a few supplies, old ration packs, a half-empty water canister. It wasn't much, but it would hold them over. He turned back to the group, offering one of the ration bars to the woman. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the food. "It's not poisoned," he said dryly. She stared at him a moment longer before accepting it, carefully breaking the bar into smaller pieces and handing them to the children first. They took them eagerly, small fingers grasping at the food, but they didn't eat right away. They looked to her for permission. Only when she nodded did they finally take hesitant bites, chewing slowly, their expressions cautious. Garen watched them for a moment before turning his attention back to the woman. Now that they weren't running for their lives, he could see the full extent of her injuries. The gash on her temple had stopped bleeding, but dried blood streaked the side of her face. Bruises had started to form along her arms, dark patches against her silver-blue skin. He reached into his pack, pulling out a roll of bandages. "You're hurt." She tensed slightly as he stepped closer. "I'll live," she said. "Yeah, well, you'll live better if you let me patch you up." Her gaze held his for a long moment before, finally, she gave a small nod of reluctant agreement. He crouched in front of her, carefully tilting her chin to the side so he could get a better look at the wound. Up close, he could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But she was letting him do this, and that was something. This might sting, he warned, dampening a cloth with water before pressing it gently against the dried blood. She barely flinched. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with careful precision. The children watched him closely, their small hands still gripping their mother's clothing. The younger one, a boy who looked no older than 5, edged a little closer. "Are you a doctor?" he asked, voice soft. Garen huffed a quiet laugh. "Not even close, kid." The boy frowned. "Then why do you know how to do this?" Garen hesitated. "Because I've been hurt before, and sometimes there's no one else to do it." The boy seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding solemnly. Garen finished cleaning the wound and began wrapping the bandage around her head, securing it with practiced efficiency. She remained still throughout, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable. "You fight well," she said suddenly. Garen arched a brow. "So do you." She didn't deny it. Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken questions. He had 1,000 of them, but he didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, glancing at the children. "You got names?" The boy nodded. "I'm Rien. My sister's Lyra." Garen nodded in return before shifting his gaze back to their mother. "And you?" She hesitated, then finally, "Serha." The name settled between them like a fragile truce. Garen nodded again. "All right, Serha, get some rest. We move at first light." She didn't argue, didn't ask where they were going. Maybe she didn't care, as long as it was away from here. As she settled down with her children, Garen took first watch, his rifle resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the door. The world outside was still burning, but for now, in this small, dimly lit refuge, they were safe. The wind outside howled against the reinforced metal of the maintenance station, rattling loose panels and sending a low, eerie whistle through the cracks. It carried the scent of ash and distant rain, a bitter reminder that the world outside was still burning. Inside the shelter, however, there was nothing but stillness. Tense, uncertain, but quiet nonetheless. Garen sat near the entrance, rifle resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the wasteland beyond. The darkness had begun to lift, the first pale streaks of dawn creeping across the horizon, but it did little to ease his unease. The woman, Serha, as he now knew her, was awake too. He had heard her moving, soft, rustling sounds as she adjusted the blanket over her children, whispering something low and soothing in a language he didn't understand. Rien and Lyra had slept, curled into her side, pressed close for warmth and security. The boy stirred first, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before glancing over at Garen. He still regarded him with something between wariness and curiosity, as if he hadn't quite decided yet whether to be afraid of him. Lyra remained asleep, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of her mother's cloak. Sarah moved carefully as she rose to her feet, stretching out the stiffness in her limbs. She was trying not to show it, but Garen could see the tension in her posture, the way her muscles stiffened against the aches and bruises she was undoubtedly carrying. The bandage he had wrapped around her temple the night before was already stained with a faint trace of blood, but she hadn't complained about it once. He glanced at her leg. She had tried to hide it, but she wasn't walking properly. "You're favoring your left side," he noted without looking up from his rifle. Serha stopped mid-step, her gaze flickering toward him. "I can walk," she said. "That wasn't my question." She exhaled through her nose, clearly not in the mood for an argument. But before she could say anything else, a soft whimper broke the silence. Lyra was awake now, her small face scrunched up in distress. Her fingers dug into the fabric of Serha's cloak as she clung to her mother, violet eyes glassy with lingering exhaustion. "Shh, Gumaeti," Serha murmured, smoothing her hand over the child's dark hair. "We are safe." Lyra turned her head slightly, peeking at Garen before quickly burying her face against Serha's side. He sighed, reaching into his pack and pulling out a ration bar. Without a word, he tossed it toward Rian, who caught it with clumsy fingers. "For us?" the boy asked hesitantly. "Who else?" Garen replied dryly. Rian studied him for a second, as if expecting some kind of trick, but when Garen said nothing else, he finally peeled open the package. The moment Lyra heard the crinkle of the wrapper, she peeked out again. "It smells bad," she whispered. Garen snorted. "Tastes worse." Lyra looked up at her mother. "Do I have to eat it?" Sarah stroked her daughter's hair. "It will keep your belly full." Lyra sighed dramatically before taking a tiny, reluctant bite. Her nose wrinkled, but she chewed without complaint. Serha settled beside them, shifting her injured leg carefully as she leaned against the cold metal wall. Garen noticed the wince she tried to hide. He watched her for a moment before setting his rifle aside and pulling out the med kit again. "Let me see your leg," he said. Sarah stiffened. "It is fine. You're bleeding through your boot." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced down, and sure enough, a dark stain had seeped through the fabric above her ankle. She cursed under her breath in her own language. Garen shook his head, exasperated. "Sit." She hesitated. He could tell she didn't like this, being vulnerable, accepting help. But after a long pause, she finally lowered herself onto a crate, lifting her injured leg. Garen crouched in front of her, carefully peeling back the torn fabric around the wound. The cut wasn't deep, but it had reopened from too much movement. He pulled out a clean cloth, doused it with antiseptic, and pressed it against the wound. Serha barely flinched, though he caught the subtle way her fingers curled against her knee. "This is unnecessary," she muttered. "You're welcome," he said flatly, securing a fresh bandage around her leg. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant wind outside and the quiet chewing of the children as they ate. Then Serha finally broke the silence. "You have done this before," she said. Garen kept his focus on wrapping the bandage. "What, bandaging wounds?" "Helping strangers." He paused, just for a fraction of a second before tying off the wrap. He let out a slow breath. "Not as often as I should." Serha studied him with those unreadable violet eyes. He could feel her gaze lingering, as if she was trying to see past whatever wall he had built around himself. But she didn't press him for more. Instead, she shifted her attention back to her children, running her fingers gently through Lyra's tangled hair. Garen stood, stretching out the stiffness in his shoulders. "We need to move soon," he said. Serha looked up at him. "Where?" "There's a settlement north of here," he explained. "Heavily fortified, well armed. They take in refugees." She frowned slightly. "And they will take us?" Garen knew what she was really asking. Would they take an alien? He exhaled. "They'll take anyone who can pull their weight." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer before she finally gave a slow nod. A flicker of movement caught Garen's attention. Rian had crawled a little closer, still clutching what was left of his ration bar. He hesitated, then looked up at Garen with wide eyes. "Are you a soldier?" he asked. Garen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Something like that." "Did you fight the raiders before?" "Yeah." "Did you win?" Garen hesitated. He thought of the burning colony, of the bodies he hadn't been able to save, of the ones he had left behind. "Not always," he admitted. Rian seemed to think about that. Then, to Garen's surprise, the boy reached into his small pocket and pulled out a small, battered metal badge. He held it out to Garen. "For good luck," the boy said simply. Garen stared at it for a moment before carefully taking it. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the worn edges, the faded engraving. "Thanks, kid," he said quietly. Serha watched the exchange but said nothing. Garen tucked the badge into his pocket, then picked up his rifle. "We leave in an hour." Serha nodded, her gaze still unreadable. As Garen moved back toward the entrance, keeping watch for any sign of movement outside, he felt something shift between them. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was something, a step closer. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, curling through the canyon like a ghostly whisper. The fire between them burned low, casting shifting shadows against the rocky walls. It was a fragile light, flickering against the vast darkness that surrounded them. Garen sat with his back against a boulder, rifle within reach, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. Even now, with nothing but silence stretching into the night, his muscles remained tense, ready. Serha sat across from him, wrapped in his jacket. It was too big on her, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but she hadn't taken it off since he had given it to her. She sat with her legs folded beneath her arms wrapped around herself, her violet eyes fixed on the fire as if searching for answers in the embers. Her long black hair fell over one shoulder, the loose strands shifting in the cold breeze. She looked lost in thought, but Garen knew better. This woman was never truly lost. "You should rest," he said, his voice quiet in the stillness. Serha didn't look at him. "I should," she agreed, but she didn't move. A gust of wind blew through the canyon, stirring the fire, and she shivered slightly. She held his jacket tighter around herself, fingers curling into the fabric. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The children were asleep, their small forms curled together beneath a thin blanket, their breathing slow and steady. The sight of them, so small, so fragile, tightened something in Garen's chest. Then, finally, Serha broke the silence. "My people do not take back those they cast out," she said, her voice distant. Garen frowned slightly. He had expected something else, maybe a question, maybe another quiet remark about how he never slept, but not this. "Why did they cast you out?" he asked. Serha was quiet for a long moment. Then, without looking at him, she spoke. "My husband was a warrior," she said, "respected. When he died, I was given a choice. Take another mate or be cast out." Garen exhaled through his nose. "And you refused?" A small, humorless smile ghosted across her lips. "I refused." Her fingers brushed absently against the frayed edge of her cloak. "To them, a woman without a mate is unfinished, a loose thread. They told me I was unfit to raise my own children alone, that I was selfish for denying them a father, that I was dangerous for choosing solitude over duty." Garen watched her carefully. He had heard stories like this before, cultures that placed more value on tradition than on the individuals within them. But hearing it now from her made his blood run hot. "So they abandoned you," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Serha shook her head slowly. "Not abandoned, erased. To them, I no longer exist." She spoke the words evenly, without self-pity, but that made it worse. She had lived with this truth for so long that it no longer hurt the way it once had. Garen clenched his jaw. "That's bullshit." Serha blinked, looking at him as if startled by his bluntness. Then, to his surprise, she let out a quiet, breathy laugh. "Yes," she admitted, "it is." The fire crackled between them. Garen didn't look away from her, didn't let the weight of her words disappear into the night. He had seen her fight, seen her endure, seen the quiet strength in the way she carried herself. And yet, the people who should have valued that most had thrown her away like she was nothing. Except she wasn't nothing. "You fought harder than anyone I've met," he said. "That means something." Sarah's expression shifted, something flickering in her violet eyes. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "To you, maybe." Garen scoffed. "To anyone who isn't an idiot." Her lips twitched slightly, almost a smile. But then her gaze dropped to the fire, her fingers tightening around his jacket. "I have not allowed myself to need anyone for a long time," she admitted. Garen didn't answer right away. He knew what she was really saying. Trust was hard-earned, and for someone who had been cast aside by her own people, letting someone in again was a risk. "You don't have to need me," he said finally. "But you don't have to run from me either." Sarah inhaled sharply, like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she did something else. She moved closer. Not much, just enough that he could feel her warmth beside him, just enough that the space between them no longer felt insurmountable. Her shoulder barely brushed his, but it was there, solid, real. His heartbeat picked up, slow but steady. He turned to her and she turned to him. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, cautiously, he reached up. His fingers brushed lightly against her cheek, tracing over the faint bruise that had begun to fade. Sarah's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. Her violet eyes searched his, hesitation flickering in their depths. And then finally she closed the distance. The kiss was tentative at first, careful, a test, but when neither of them pulled away, when Garen's hand slid to the back of her neck and her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, it deepened into something more. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the breaking of a barrier. The unspoken, the unanswered, all of it crashing together in a moment that neither of them had been prepared for. Sarah exhaled against his lips, something between relief and surrender. Garen's grip tightened slightly, as if anchoring her there, as if telling her without words that he wasn't going anywhere. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling in the cold night air. "You are reckless, human," she whispered. Garen smirked, his voice hoarse, "And you're stubborn." Serha let out a quiet, breathless laugh. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The illusion of safety shattered in an instant. They had left the canyon at dawn, following the winding path that would lead them to the settlement before nightfall. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the promise of rain lingering in the overcast sky. For the first time in days, the journey had been quiet. No signs of pursuit, no distant gunfire, no smoke on the horizon. Garen should have known better. The first warning was the change in the wind. The second was the low hum of engines. He stopped mid-step, his entire body going rigid. The distant sound of skiff thrusters echoed through the valley, growing louder with every second. He turned sharply, scanning the ridge behind them. Dust trails. Too many. Serha was already at his side, her breath sharp. How many? At least 3 skiffs, maybe more. Garen didn't take his eyes off the horizon. They found us. Serha inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Then she did what he knew she would. She turned to her children. "Rien, lire." Her voice was calm, controlled. "Go to the rocks and stay low." The children obeyed without hesitation, their small hands gripping the fabric of her cloak before darting toward the shelter of an outcropping. Garen adjusted his grip on his rifle, mind racing. They were too exposed here. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. There was only one option. "I'll lead them away," he said, already calculating the best route. "You take the kids and keep moving." Serha's head snapped toward him, eyes flashing. "No, it's not up for debate." "I said no," she hissed. "I will not leave you behind." Her defiance might have been admirable if the engines weren't closing in fast. He didn't have time for this. "Serha, they will kill you." The way she said it, sharp, certain, made him pause. She wasn't just arguing, she was afraid. The engines roared, and before he could respond, the first skiff came into view. There was no more time. Garen moved first. He dropped to one knee, rifle raised, exhaling slowly as he took aim. The first shot struck the lead driver in the chest, sending the skiff careening into a rock formation. The explosion sent debris flying, forcing the second vehicle to swerve sharply. Then the gunfire began. The raiders spread out, plasma bolts scorching the ground as Garen returned fire. He took out 2 before they could find cover, but they weren't amateurs. They adjusted quickly, advancing fast. He heard Serha fire behind him. A sharp cry rang out, one of the raiders dropping mid-charge. She was holding her ground, but there were too many. A shot grazed Garen's shoulder, heat searing through fabric and skin. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. Another came too close, forcing him to duck behind a rock. Then he heard it. Lyra's scream. His head snapped up just in time to see a raider charging toward the children. Serha moved before Garin could. She was fast, faster than he expected. She lunged, tackling the raider to the ground, her blade flashing. The man barely had time to react before she drove it into his throat. But she wasn't fast enough to dodge the next attack. Another raider struck her from behind, slamming the butt of a rifle into her ribs. Serha gasped, staggering, her hands catching the dirt as she fell to one knee. Garin didn't think. He moved. He put a bullet through the raider's skull before the man could take another step toward her. The last enemy hesitated. That was all Garin needed. He closed the distance in 3 strides, catching the man's arm before he could raise his weapon. They struggled, feet kicking up dust, fists colliding. The raider landed a solid hit to Garin's ribs, but he barely felt it through the rush of adrenaline. He twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, driving his knife up beneath the ribs. The raider gurgled, slumping forward. Then, silence. Garin barely registered his own breathing, the sharp pain in his side, the weight of his injuries. His gaze went straight to Serha. She was still on her knees, one hand pressed against her ribs. Blood smeared her fingers. "Serha!" he rasped, moving toward her. She looked up at him, her violet eyes flickering with too many emotions at once. "You are a fool," she whispered. "You should not risk yourself like this." Garin exhaled, dropping to one knee beside her. Too late for that. Her hands trembled slightly as he reached for her. His fingers brushed against her skin, feeling the heat of battle still clinging to her. She inhaled sharply. "I don't know how to stop fearing this." "You don't have to," he murmured. "Just don't run from it." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Serha did something unexpected. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Her breathing was uneven, her fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket. And then, before he could fully register what was happening, she kissed him. It wasn't careful this time. It wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, fierce. She kissed him as if she were trying to convince herself that he was still alive, still here. And Garin, he kissed her back just as fiercely. Her hands tightened in his jacket, holding him there, grounding herself. His fingers slid against the curve of her jaw, anchoring her in return. The battle, the blood, the exhaustion, all of it faded. There was only this. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths were unsteady. Serha's forehead rested against his, her fingers still tangled in his shirt. "You are reckless, human," she whispered. Garin smirked, voice hoarse. "And you're stubborn." Serha let out a quiet, breathless laugh. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The settlement came into view just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land. It was built into the remnants of an old colony outpost, reinforced with metal barricades and scavenged defenses. Watchtowers stood along the perimeter, their searchlights sweeping across the barren landscape. It wasn't much to look at, but to Garin it was the safest place left in this wasteland. He felt the tension in Serha before he even turned to look at her. She had slowed her pace, her grip tightening on Lyra's small hand. Riyadh walked beside her, unusually quiet, his sharp eyes scanning the settlement's towering gates. Garin adjusted his rifle across his back. "They'll take us in," he said, keeping his voice even. Serha exhaled, her expression unreadable. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be." He glanced down at the children who were watching the settlement with equal parts curiosity and apprehension. "They won't turn away 2 kids who need shelter." He looked at Serha again. "And they won't turn you away either." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she gave a small nod. She didn't argue, but she also didn't look convinced. They approached the gate slowly, Garin raising a hand in greeting. The guards on the watchtower hesitated only a moment before recognizing him. The heavy doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the settlement beyond. Inside, the air smelled of metal, smoke, and cooking fires. People moved through the streets, some armed, some carrying supplies. all of them hardened by the same unforgiving world. Children ran past laughing, chasing each other through the narrow walkways. It was a strange contrast. This place was built on survival, yet there was life here, something real, something that wasn't just fighting and running. Serha took a slow breath, as if trying to steady herself. Rian and Lyra pressed closer to her, their small hands gripping her cloak. A woman in a reinforced jacket approached, her dark eyes sharp as she took in the new arrivals. Garen stepped forward. "They're with me," he said. "They need shelter." The woman studied Serha for a long moment, her gaze flicking to the children. Finally, she nodded. "We don't turn people away," she said. "If they work, they stay." Serha inclined her head. "I will earn my place." The woman gave her another assessing look before gesturing for them to follow. "Come on, you'll need a place to sleep." As they walked deeper into the settlement, Garen glanced at Serha. She held herself stiffly, her expression unreadable, but he could see the way her fingers trembled slightly against Lyra's back. "You okay?" he asked under his breath. She didn't answer right away, then, quietly, "I don't know how to stop waiting for something to go wrong." Garen exhaled, glancing around at the people, the families, the structures that had stood despite the destruction outside. "Maybe it won't," he said. She gave him a look, as if the idea was completely foreign to her. They reached a small structure near the edge of the settlement, a repurposed storage unit converted into living quarters. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and it was warm. The children entered first, their movements cautious but curious. Serha lingered at the doorway. Garen stepped beside her. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "You don't have to keep running." Serha turned to him then, and for the first time since they met, she didn't look like she was preparing to fight. Slowly, carefully, she reached for his hand. Her fingers were cool against his, hesitant at first, but she didn't pull away. "You're certain?" she asked again, but this time her voice was different. Garen looked at her, really looked at her, and gave the only answer that mattered. "Yeah," he said, "I'm certain." And for the first time, she let herself believe it. The wound on Garen's side had finally started to heal. It no longer burned with every breath, no longer pulled painfully when he moved. The bruising had faded, and the stitches, rough but effective, held firm. Sir had been the one to take care of it, of course. She hadn't trusted the settlement's medics, not because they were unskilled, but because he was hers to protect. Garen hadn't argued. He had let her clean the wound, change the bandages, press her cool fingers against his skin with gentle efficiency. Now, as the afternoon sun cast golden light over the settlement, Garen stretched, rolling his shoulder to test the stiffness. A dull ache remained, but it was a small price to pay. From where he stood, he could see Serha sitting beneath a low tree, the children giggling as they played around her. Lyra ran in circles, her tiny hands reaching toward the sky, while Rion tried to catch her. They had found something that resembled a ball, probably a repurposed piece of old machinery, and had spent the better part of the morning chasing each other through the dusty streets. Serha, ever watchful, sat with her legs folded beneath her, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders as she observed them. But for the first time, she wasn't just watching for danger. She was smiling. Garen made his way toward them, pausing as Riyadh spotted him. "You're not fast enough to play," the boy announced, arms crossed. Garen arched a brow. "That's so? You still hurt?" Garen smirked. "I think I'm good enough to take on a couple of kids." Priya narrowed his eyes, considering the challenge. Then, without warning, he threw the ball straight at Garen's chest. Garen caught it effortlessly. "Not bad," he admitted, "but I've seen raiders throw harder." Rian's face lit up with determination. "That's because you haven't seen me throw yet." Lyra gasped, giggling, and clapped her hands. "He's going to get you, Garen." Garen barely had time to react before Rian lunged, and suddenly all strategy was abandoned in favor of chaos. Lyra shrieked with laughter as she tackled Garen's leg, and Rien grabbed at his arm, trying to wrestle the ball from his grip. All right, Garen laughed, pretending to struggle. You two are relentless. Serha watched, amusement dancing in her violet eyes. I did warn you, she said. Garen shot her a look. You could help. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. I am helping. I'm supervising. Rien and Lyra giggled as they tried to drag Garen down. He let them win, falling back into the dirt with an exaggerated groan. Victory! Rien declared, pumping a fist into the air. Lyra beamed, clambering onto Garen's chest as if she had just conquered a great beast. We win! Garen sighed dramatically. Guess I'm done for. Serha shook her head, standing gracefully and making her way toward them. You let them win. Maybe, Garen admitted. Or maybe they're just that good. Serha crouched beside him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Lyra's face before turning her gaze to him. You're healing, she murmured, her fingers lightly skimming the fabric of his shirt, just over where the wound had been. Garen caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it there. I had a good healer. Something unreadable passed through her expression, something deep and warm. Slowly she leaned in, her lips pressing softly against his. It was a quiet thing, not rushed or desperate, just a moment stolen between them. Something theirs. Rien groaned. Again. Lyra giggled. Mama likes kissing Garen. Sarah pulled back, but she didn't look away from Garen, her smile lingering. Hush, she told them, her voice full of quiet laughter. Garen smirked, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. Can't argue with the kid. Serha rolled her eyes, but there was no irritation in it, only warmth. For the first time, in what felt like forever, they weren't running. There was no gunfire in the distance, no raiders closing in, no desperate struggle for survival. There was just this... the laughter of children, the warmth of a setting sun, the weight of Serha's hand in his. A future, their future. And for the first time, Garen let himself believe in it. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the settlement. The air was cool but comfortable, carrying the faint scent of burning wood from the communal fires. The distant hum of voices filled the streets, laughter, conversation, the sounds of life. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had once filled their nights, the tension of always looking over their shoulders. Garen stood near the edge of the settlement, looking out over the land beyond the barricades. The wasteland stretched endlessly in the fading light, but for the first time, he felt no urge to move forward, no restless energy pushing him to keep going. He had spent years wandering from one battlefield to another, never stopping long enough to call anywhere home. But here, now, he had something worth staying for. A small voice broke through his thoughts. Garen. He turned just in time to catch Lyra as she barreled into him, her tiny arms wrapping around his leg. He huffed a small laugh, ruffling her dark hair. Didn't see you coming, little warrior, he said, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Lyra giggled, curling her fingers into the fabric of his jacket. Mama says it's almost time to eat. That's so? He glanced toward the small dwelling they now shared. From the open doorway he could see Serha inside, moving with quiet efficiency as she prepared the meal. Rien sat at the table, concentrating intensely as he carved something into a small piece of wood with a dull knife. The boy had picked up the habit from some of the older settlers, fascinated by the way they shaped scraps into something useful. It was such a simple sight, so normal, that it made something tighten in Garen's chest. Lyra wiggled in his arms and he set her down, watching as she ran ahead. He followed at a slower pace, stepping inside just as Serha turned. You let them run wild, she teased. They're small, I can take them. Serha shook her head, but there was amusement in her eyes. She gestured toward the table. Sit, eat. Garen didn't argue. The meal was simple. Stew made from whatever the settlement's hunters had brought back. Bread that was a little too dense but warm. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. They ate together, the way a family would. Rian chattered about the things he had learned. Lyra made a mess of her bowl. And Sarah sat beside Garen, her presence solid and real, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. Later, after the meal was done and the children had fallen asleep in their shared cot, Garen stepped outside again. The night was quiet, stars stretching endlessly overhead. Serha followed him, her steps light against the dirt. She stood beside him, arms crossed against the evening chill. "You don't have to keep watching the horizon," she murmured. He glanced at her, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Habit." Her gaze searched his. "And if you broke it?" Garen considered that, considered staying. Then, without a word, he reached for her. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into him, pressing her forehead against his, her hands resting against his chest. "You don't have to keep running," she whispered. Garen exhaled slowly, his hands settling at her waist, grounding himself in the warmth of her presence. "I know." And for the first time in his life, he meant it.
And helps me keep creating amazing content for you.